Skid Row Stabber. Between the years of 1964 and 1975, a serial killer would stalk Southern California in search of victims that tend to live in the shadows of society, the homeless. Over 11 years, he would kill 11 homeless men, earning the nickname the Skid Row Slasher. Since he always used a knife, he committed his first crimes in 1964 and was later arrested in Chicago for an assault with a knife, which put him away for 10 years, where he then made his way back to LA in 1974 and killed 9 more homeless men. Now, he would eventually be captured in 1975, and he was identified as Vaughn Greenwood. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison and died in 2020. So it's with that background that a sort of grim irony would play out over the next mystery, because it was only 2 years later that a new Skid Row serial killer appeared on the scene. One with the same exact MO. The murders would begin in October of 1978 and lasted until 1979, when 12 homeless men were stabbed to death. Many of these were attacked while they slept in doorways, or in vacant lots, or even under bushes. This led to the new moniker, Skid Row Stabber. His victims, unlike other serial killers, did not stick to one race or age, or anything like that. It was just strictly the homeless and other vagrants. Detectives, learning from their experience dealing with the Skid Row Slasher, began going through recent arrest records in hopes of getting a lead. They soon found an unemployed man from Tennessee named Bobby Joe Maxwell, who had been arrested just 2 months prior and charged with assault with a deadly weapon, which was a knife. He had been released after 2 months in jail, and the murders began almost immediately. And over the next month, between October 23rd and November 23rd, 10 victims were killed. One of these was a double murder. But other than the fact that Maxwell had just been released before the murders, they really had no proof he was connected. But it's on December 14th that they would catch a break, when they spotted him standing over a drunk man sleeping on the sidewalk. They stopped him and searched, only to find a double-edged stainless steel cork-handled knife. Maxwell would be booked for carrying a concealed weapon, and interestingly, police stated his knife was compatible with the wounds of 8 victims. But since this was the days before DNA, it was actually pretty difficult to prove that it was the weapon used. Maxwell would remain in jail for about a month and was released on January 18th, 1979, and just 2 days later, the last murder of the Skid Row Stabber would occur. So it was looking pretty good for having Maxwell as the suspect. In fact, detectives were confident that the 2-month break between his murder on November 23rd and this one on January 21st was due to the fact that he was in jail most of that time. Police after this kept Maxwell under surveillance, and he was eventually arrested 3 months later on April 4th, and his case went to trial 4 years later in 1983, and he was largely convicted on circumstantial evidence. Now, I won't go into all the details about the victims, simply because it would take a lot of time, but they aged in range from 26 to 65, and they were all homeless or considered vagrants. Maxwell was charged with the 12 murders, but only convicted of 2 of them, which put him away for good. So where is the mystery? Well, quite frankly, he was innocent, but because of some sloppy and lazy work by the prosecution, an innocent man would spend life in prison for the next 30 years. See, basically, the city had nothing other than the fact that his timeline in and out of jail did match up with the murders. And I know you might be thinking, well, he had a knife, but at that time on Skid Row, many people carried knives, and probably do today. Maxwell was largely convicted on 2 really bad bits of evidence. A piece of cardboard that was placed next to one of the victims that had the inscription, Satan, scribbled in. You gotta remember, this was during the time of the Satanic Panic. Anyways, someone, possibly the real killer, had also written another message on a Greyhound station bathroom wall that read, "My name is Luther. I kill winos to put them out of their misery." This was important because one of the attacks occurred in front of witnesses who said the man called himself Luther. These witnesses were also friends of the victim, David Jones, and apparently they had talked to this man quite a while before he launched into his attack on David. They described him as a 30-year-old black man with a Puerto Rican accent. These witnesses were brought in to identify Maxwell in a police lineup, and they all said the same thing. The man I seen is not in the lineup. The police at this point started to persuade the men to say that it was Maxwell, as they were just wanting to quiet a panic that had never fully died down from the Skid Row slasher. One of these witnesses would even tell the police, if this is the man you claim is responsible, he sure has changed his physical appearance. Going back to the scribbled messages though, handwriting experts were brought in to compare the two messages, and they confirmed it was a match. They then took it a step further and claimed that same writing matched personal notes that had been scribbled in by Maxwell in his notebook. But here's where it gets really offensive. The prosecution still knew they didn't really have a case, but they were desperate, and they soon found their key witness, a man named Sidney Storch, a former police officer who had converted into a criminal with an extensive record, and was often a police informant. He was especially known for his forgery skills. He would share a cell with Maxwell and soon struck up a deal with the prosecutor to be released in exchange for testifying against him, whom he claimed had told him he was upset at himself for the mistakes he had made that led to him being caught. However, you probably know where this is going now, because Storch had made several of these deals with prosecutors over the years. Anytime he ended up in jail, he would snitch on someone, and most of the time, he was just making it up. In fact, everything he told about Maxwell's case was stuff that was already in the newspapers, and he would also admit to having made up the entire story of Maxwell's confession and stated the only facts that he knew was what he had read in the newspapers. And just like that, several convictions based on Storch's snitching were overturned and the prisoners were released, all except for Maxwell. It was like Los Angeles couldn't accept the fact that they had made a mistake, which is strange because the only other clue that they had was his palm print on a park bench that was in the vicinity of one of the murders, a park bench he was seen sitting at on several different occasions. This also doesn't take into account that Maxwell's own lawyers had already accepted a book rights deal to his story in exchange for court fees, which led the judge to question how would they make their money in the event that Maxwell was found innocent, because the book deal would be worthless then, meaning they didn't have much of a vested interest in finding their own client not guilty. It seemed the whole system was rigged against him, which might be why the state also brought witnesses out during the sentencing phase that all spoke out against the death sentence. In any case, Maxwell appealed for decades, and there were actually a lot of people inside the court system that knew he got a bad deal, but they couldn't do much to change it, until 2010, when the news about Storch's fake confessions became public knowledge. Maxwell's sentence was then overturned, and he got a new trial, which took years to get going, and in 2017, he suffered a severe heart attack which put him in a coma, one he never recovered from. But in 2018, all the charges were dropped, and he was found not guilty, and his conviction and prison sentence were ruled miscarriages of justice. Maxwell would never know that though, because he never regained consciousness, and he died in April of 2019. I would go into theories, but this one's just too depressing. Plus, LA was so focused on him that they never tried to find any other suspects, and the real Skid Row stabber was never apprehended. Stewart Gardner Museum Heist, March 18th, 1990, Boston, Massachusetts. It was shortly after midnight on St. Patrick's Day when two security guards were attending to their long but boring shift at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. 25-year-old Randy Heston, who had long served as the watchman on day shift, was on his first night shift duty. He would be working along with the main night watchman, 23-year-old Rick Abath. Coincidentally, the extra security guard came about due to other circumstances, as the building had been facing serious security risk as all the precautions were outdated. The FBI, too, had previously told the museum it had uncovered a plot to rob it some 8 years earlier, which prompted the museum to make additional security measures. However, they didn't go all out. In fact, they didn't even put cameras in the museum. Instead, they made the cost-saving judgment that an additional guard would just be cheaper. That was a mistake that would come back to haunt them, because Rick would take his first patrol around the galleries with his flashlight that night, while Randy who was on his first night shift, sat back at the security desk, which was the standard protocol. But while Rick was walking around, the fire alarm suddenly went off. He quickly began looking for smoke, but could not locate any or a fire. This prompted him to run to the security room, not the security desk, where Randy was stationed, and he checked the fire alarm control panel, which indicated that several rooms were on fire. But since he had checked everywhere in the building pretty much and seen no fire, he assumed there was a malfunction. He then disabled it on the panel and returned to his patrol, but not before doing something which would perplex future investigators. Before going back, he stopped at the side entrance of the museum, briefly opened the side door and shut it back, and never informed Randy of this. Rick would then return to the desk at 1 a.m., and Randy would take over, which left Rick at the security desk alone. And it was here that the buzzer from outside rang into him through the intercom, and it was coming from the side entrance, the same door he had just opened. When Rick answered it, they stated that they were the police investigating a disturbance, and they must be admitted in. Rick would peer through the outside cameras, which had been put in during the security upgrade, and he seen two men out there wearing police uniforms. Rick was not aware of any disturbance, but wondered if someone had partied a little bit too much on St. Patrick's Day, and then climbed over the fence, which led to someone else reporting it to the police. Although, I do have to wonder how he did not think that it had something to do with the smoke alarm. In any case, Rick would open up the door remotely from his desk at 1:24 a.m., and the two officers, fake officers, entered the museum and made their way to the security desk. It was here that they asked Rick if anyone else was in the museum, and he would say yes, and called Randy up to the front on his walkie-talkie. That's when Rick would notice something was off. One of the two men, the taller one, seemed to have a fake mustache. Before Rick could register it though, the shorter man would tell him he looked familiar, and they thought he might have a warrant out for him. So he told Rick to come out from behind the desk and provide identification. He did, leaving the desk behind, which was the only area that had the panic button to alert the police. The shorter officer then ordered Rick against the wall, told him to spread his legs, and then he handcuffed him. About that time, Randy was walking in, and the taller thief put him up against the wall and handcuffed him. Now the gig was up, as both men admitted they were not real officers. They were there to steal art, and for the guards to not cause any problems. They then duct taped both men's eyes and took them to the basement. This was key because the guards didn't give them directions to the basement. They were then handcuffed to a steam pipe and workbench. These thieves were pretty nice though, as they took the men's wallets, got their addresses, and told them if they did not tell the police, they would receive a reward in about 1 year. Although, in reality, this was more of a veiled threat. It had only taken 15 minutes, and the guards were completely subdued, and the thieves began to move throughout the museum. They apparently stopped at one point though, and waited 13 minutes, most likely to see if the police had arrived. This was known due to the motion sensors which recorded their movements, or lack thereof. However, they did begin to remove paintings, starting with some famous Rembrandt ones, like the Storm of the Sea of Galilee and A Lady and Gentleman in Black. They would also take a large Rembrandt self-portrait oil painting off the wall, but they left it behind due to its immense size. They would instead take smaller paintings, one of these called The Concert by Dutch artist Johannes Vermeer. This is believed to now be the most valuable stolen object in the entire world, estimated to be worth around $340 million in today's money. This was followed by the final piece taken from this floor, which was an ancient Chinese ritual bronze vessel. Next, they split up and pillaged more items from the first floor, before finally returning to the basement and asking the guards if they were comfortable. From there, they went to the security director's office and took the videotapes which showed their entrance, as well as the data printouts from the motion sensors. Not realizing that data still existed on the hard drive, they then opened up the door at 2:40 a.m. and again at 2:45. The robbery just lasted about an hour and 20 minutes. The following morning, when the next guard arrived and couldn't get a hold of the front desk to be buzzed in, he called the security director, who came to the building and went in with his keys to discover the guards were not at the desk. He quickly called the police and left the building. Officers would arrive quickly though and search the building and found the guards. The theft was huge, like the biggest in museum robbery history, with some estimates from around 2010 putting it at about 600 million, or about 900 million in today's money, with the aforementioned The Concert painting accounting for about half of that. Art theft detectives were obviously brought in to go over the scene, since they were a little more well-versed than the average detective. And one of the things that puzzled them right away was how they selected the items. Sure, The Concert was a huge grab, but the men seemingly walked past other insanely valuable works, like some by Raphael, Botticelli, and Michelangelo, and took other items that were not even close to the same value. They also completely ignored the third floor, which housed one of the other most valuable paintings in the entire city. Because of this, investigators were sure that they were amateurs when it came to art, and seemed to be grabbing things randomly. They also believed that the paintings had been rolled up to allow easier transportation, which probably damaged them. A reward of $1 million was offered by the art gallery, which it came from the help of a few auction houses. By 2017, this was up to $10 million. The FBI took over the case immediately, acting under the assumption that the art could cross state lines, and their investigation has largely went nowhere, as there just wasn't much evidence. Fingerprints and footprints were found, but they couldn't tell if this was from employees or the thieves. DNA analysis was performed many years after the technology got better, but that led to nothing. And since then, other items believed to hold crucial DNA has been lost by the FBI. The guards did give pretty good descriptions though, which led to a sketch. One man was said to be about 5'9" and in his late 30s, while the other was about 6 foot in his early 30s with a heavier build. But obviously, all eyes fell on one man. Security guard Rick. Him opening up the closed side door just a few minutes before the biggest art theft in history occurred was suspicious, to say the least. It looked to investigators like he had signaled the men on the outside to begin the robbery soon. However, Rick had an answer for this. He said he routinely opened that door to make sure it was locked. However, one of his colleagues would dispute this later on, saying that if he had opened it every night, the supervisors would have found out due to the computer printouts, and they would have put a stop to that behavior. There was also the odd fact that one of the paintings had been stolen from the so-called Blue Room on the first floor, and what made that strange was none of the motion detectors reported that. The only footsteps recorded in that room that whole night was Rick's during his patrol. A security consultant would even come in and test out the equipment and determined nothing was wrong with the motion sensors, which certainly raised eyebrows. But there was even more odd behavior by Rick. In 2015, the FBI would release a videotape from the museum the night before the theft, and it straight up showed Rick admitting an unidentified man into the museum, where the two then had a conversation at the security desk. When he was asked about this, he said he couldn't identify the man. Luckily for him, several former guards came forward and identified him as the museum's deputy security chief. Still, it didn't cast Rick in the best light. But that might be why the FBI agent in charge of the early investigation basically stated both guards were dumber than a second coat of paint. Well, what he really said was they were too incompetent and foolish to have pulled this off. Now the FBI began to look at organized crime bosses like Whitey Bulger, who ran the Winter Hill Gang. He denied it, of course, and actually said he had sent out subordinates to find the men behind the robbery because it had happened on his turf and he demanded his cut. However, he did have ties to the Boston police, which could account for the legit uniforms, or maybe it was real officers. He also had ties to the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, a paramilitary force that had agents in Boston at the time, and they were known for tripping off the fire alarm before a heist, and they'd also been involved in other art thefts. In fact, one arts and antiquities investigator believed Bulger gave every bit of the haul to the IRA and it was taken back to Ireland. There was another crucial lead, however, in 1994, when the museum director would receive an anonymous letter from someone who wanted to ransom the artwork back. According to this person, he was only taken in an effort to negotiate a reduced prison sentence for someone else. But that opportunity had passed, and they no longer needed the artwork, so they decided to sell it back for $2.6 million. Under the agreement, no one would be prosecuted. The letter would even provide information known only by the museum and FBI. They were told to print out a coded message in the Boston Globe if they agreed to the terms. The museum director contacted the FBI because she thought this was a strong lead. That coded message was then printed to the paper, and a second letter arrived. This time, the anonymous person stated they were fearful of a massive investigation taking place, and they needed time to think about their options. But whoever this anonymous person was never wrote back. There was also a con man named Brian McDevitt, who had previously dressed up as a FedEx driver and went to an art museum in New York and tried to steal a Rembrandt. He had taken in handcuffs and duct tape as well, and fit the description of the larger robber, except for the thinning red hair, that is. The FBI interviewed him, and he denied his involvement and refused to take a polygraph, and since his fingerprints did not match any at the scene, he was released. Now after this, the other main suspect is the Boston Mafia, and that would take way too long to get into, as there were so many people involved and it had a lot of moving parts. But there is a ton of circumstantial evidence that links to local mob figures, and it seems that the FBI leans toward that theory. Shell Grotto, Margate. 1835, Margate, Kent, England. A farmer named James Newlove, along with his son and a few other workers, were digging up a spot for a duck pond when, after a few feet down, had their whole operation stopped by a large stone. The men all gathered around and began to look closer at this rock, which was impeding their progress, and soon realized they were looking down into a small, beautiful decorated cave, better known as a grotto. Walking down inside, the men would see a winding passageway about 8 feet high and 70 feet in length, which stopped in a rectangular room and has since become known as the altar chamber, which measured about 15 by 20 feet. The most mysterious part were the decorations, as most of the enclosure's walls and roof were adorned in a shell mosaic. In fact, there were millions of shells glued to the walls by a fine mortar similar to Roman cement. Many were formed into intricate and colorful patterns, while some were abstract and yet others were in the shapes of animals, stars, or the sun. As you can imagine, this farmer, James Newlove, was perplexed, just as much as anyone else would be. But a few years later, he would open up the grotto to the public, for a small admission fee, of course. Now that the site had become public knowledge, scholars had no idea what to make of it. Who were the designers? What was it for? How long did it take? This was a very curious part, considering that it would have almost certainly been constructed under torchlight. Most of these questions still have no answers today, almost 200 years after it was discovered. But there's one key reason to that, and that is, we have no idea when it was made, with experts only being able to suggest that it was created sometime in the past 3,000 years, which obviously doesn't really tell us much. This could probably be ascertained now with radiocarbon dating. However, the family that now owns it has not allowed that due to the fact it would need numerous samples, and the cost to have that done would be far more expensive than it would be worth. Not to mention, they wanted to keep the integrity of the artwork. So having said all of that, what are the theories for what this design's purpose was, and who was behind it? One of the earliest theories was it was a rich man's folly, which is basically just a building or some other structure built for decoration while still suggesting it was for some other purpose. This was a fairly common thing to do in the 1700s among some of the wealthier men in England. In fact, so were structures that were lined with seashells. However, there was one problem with this theory. The land this sits on never belonged to a wealthy owner, nor was it part of some larger estate. It seems to have been nothing more than simple farmland, meaning some rich man would have had to sneak onto the property of this unaware farmer and spend tons of time constructing it, or more than likely, hiring someone to. That alone would have taken many years and tons of work to carve out the passageways and transporting the nearly 5 million seashells needed, and yet that farmer would have never noticed. Likewise, follies were built to be shown off. They weren't supposed to be hidden. Instead, they were built to draw attention. Thus, the follies theory is almost certainly ruled out, which of course has led to the more crazy speculation, like it was built as a meeting place for sea witchcraft, or that it was built by the Knights Templar, or even the Freemasons. But if you believe the theory that it is thousands of years old, it could have even been built by prehistoric man as some sort of astronomical calendar. Interestingly, in 2007, a dome cave was discovered under the Palatine Hill in Rome that was, you got it, adorned with shells, mosaics, and marble in a very similar pattern to the rectangular chamber in Margate. In that discovery, many began to suggest that the Phoenicians had built it as a sanctuary sometime in the second half of the first millennium BC, as they were founding many colonies from Carthage at the time. And since we know the Phoenicians traveled vast distances, and most likely were the first ancient seafarers to explore Britain, well, you could see how it might be possible. Other scholars have tried to link the design to ancient Egypt or even ancient India. However, most think the whole thing was built with the intention to be a tourist trap, either by the owners that lived there before James Newlove or built by James Newlove himself, which is why it was open to the public shortly after it was discovered. Hey guys, guess what time it is? It's time for another small mystery roundup, where we take the mysteries where there's not a lot of data or just don't fit into the video very well. First up, we start with Serial Defecator of London. Another roundup, another pooper. This time, we go to London, England in March 2017, when a man in his 50s began hitting one suburb with poo assaults. This particular suburb, Eastlands Crescent, was a bit special though, as it's one of the more affluent neighborhoods where houses typically sell for about £1.5 million. The suspect was eventually captured on footage, and the police and social media passed around the image in hopes that someone would identify him, as they believed this was not the first time he had done this. It's just that the other victims have never reported it. Next, Shrek Public Defecator. Man, what is it with these poopers? This time, he was the Universal Orlando Resort Park, a place where a bathroom is essentially always within a 1-minute walk. But back in 2021, near the exit of the Shrek 4D, a Universal guest was making his way out the building when he seen another guest just stop right there on the stairs and drop a dookie right in front of him. And while people can get sick and not make it to the restroom in time, this was not one of those cases. Instead, it just seemed like he wanted to do it. These people are driving me crazy. Next, Servant Girl Annihilator. If you have watched this series for a while, you know I rarely ever throw unsolved murders into the small mystery roundup segment, only in rare occasions with unique circumstances, and that's what we have here. But before I get to those circumstances, let's take a look at the case details. The Servant Girl Annihilator was a serial killer operating in Austin, Texas, almost a complete year between December 30th, 1884 and December 24th, 1885. His victim profile, as the name hints, was usually black servant girls for the more wealthy white families in the area, although they weren't always servants, white, or even female, which is why he also garnered the nickname Midnight Assassin. As mentioned, the attack started on December 30th, 1884, when a 25-year-old, Molly Smith, was murdered. She was a black cook who was found in the snow with a gaping hole in her head, as she had been attacked by an axe. Her boyfriend, Walter Spencer, was arrested and charged, in spite of the fact he had been attacked too. Those charges were ultimately dropped. Next was Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, two Swedish servant girls who were viciously attacked March 19th, 1885, but survived. This was just 3 months after the first attack. 2 months later, on May 7th, was 30-year-old Eliza Shelley, who was not as lucky, as she was killed with an axe while she slept. This was followed 2 weeks later on May 23rd, when 33-year-old Irene Cross was stabbed to death in her bed. This was followed later in August by an attack on a woman named Clara Dick, who survived but was left seriously wounded. By the end of August, the youngest victim, Mary Ramey, 11 years old, was assaulted and then murdered. while her mother Rebecca was left seriously wounded. About a month after this, in late September, 25-year-old Orange Washington was killed with an axe while he slept. This was the first male victim, but he was only attacked because he was asleep next to his 20-year-old girlfriend, Gracie Vance, who was also attacked while she slept, and then carried into the backyard where she was found violated and murdered. There were 2 other people in the room that night that were also attacked, Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson, 17 years old, who both escaped with injuries. This is when things would amp up, because up to this point, all of the victims were African American, and although it did cause quite a scare in Austin, it reached a fever pitch when on Christmas Eve, 41-year-old Susan Hancock was murdered with an axe while she slept and then dragged out into the backyard, followed later that night by Eula Phillips, 17 years old, who was attacked while sleeping and dragged into the backyard, violated and murdered. Her husband was also attacked, 24-year-old James Phillips, but he survived. The last 2 victims were white and sent shockwaves through Austin. The city was bordering on becoming a police state, with more active patrols than ever, and even the governor became involved. Now let's get to the reasons why I put it in the Small Mystery Roundup. Well, for one, we're missing a lot of the records. It's been close to 150 years, and a lot of the original documents have been lost or never existed in the first place. Secondly, the case has largely been overshadowed by another killer you may have heard of. That's right, Jack the Ripper, whose reign of terror began 4 years later and went on to become the most written about serial killer ever, leaving very few authors to tackle the servant girl annihilator. This also leads to the last reason I included it here. Many armchair sleuths, and especially Ripperologists, have tried to claim the servant girl annihilator, felt the heat growing in Texas, and promptly fled to London, where he continued his attacks 2 years later. However, there is no evidence for that, and it is a stretch at best. In fact, we pretty much know who the killer was, a 19-year-old African-American cook named Nathan Elgin. And how do we know it was him? There are quite a few clues that pretty much confirm it, although it will never be 100%. First of all, were a few of the murder scenes, in which the victim wore no shoes and left bloody footprints. They were distinctive because the killer's right foot was missing his little toe, which Elgin was missing. Secondly, he was apprehended in the midst of an attack on another girl, a woman he dragged out of the saloon and into a house. She began to scream, and the assault was interrupted by a police officer, John Bracken. Elgin launched at him with a knife, and he was shot by the officer and died the next day, which revealed the missing toe. There's also the fact that Elgin worked in close proximity to every crime scene, but most importantly, this last attempt that led to his death was just 2 months after his attacks on Christmas Eve, and after this, he never struck again, meaning it's more than likely that Elgin was the servant girl annihilator and not the same man that went to London 3 years later and became Jack the Ripper. Next, Sherwood Forest. Sherwood Forest is a play on the word Sherwood Forest and is a swamp located in Brick, New Jersey that is known for several white dress shirts hanging from trees for no discernible reason. It was first discovered on October 17, 1999, where 17 shirts were found hanging about 20 feet up, only to be outdone 12 days later when it was discovered 12 additional shirts were found hanging up. These shirts are often nailed or just draped over tree trunks and branches protruding from the swamp water. The shirts are weathered and are occasionally changed out or are laid out in a different arrangement. Interestingly, residents have tossed rocks or sticks at the shirts, only to hear a starchy cracking sound, like the shirts have been coated before they were hung up. There has never been an explanation as to who is doing it or why. And that brings us to the conclusion of this small mystery roundup. But before we get back to the video, if you enjoy the content and channel and would like to help support it, please check out the members section or my Patreon linked in the description below. Now, let's get back to it. Shaanxi Village. We have all heard of that one mystery, the vanishing of Roanoke, which is no doubt one of the most famous of all time. And we have even discussed the Anjakuni Lake mystery, a legend that claims a whole Inuit village seemingly vanished within a short period of time, only to be found by a trapper who claimed food was even cooking when he arrived. But are there any modern-day versions of this type of story? Maybe so. Our mystery begins in a village in the Qingling Mountains in China, where around 1,000 residents lived. The year was 1987, and although the details are scarce, because of the censorship in China, the only thing that survives is the basic story, which is, this village simply vanished overnight. And it wasn't just 1,000 residents. It included their pets and livestock. In addition, witnesses were even said to have seen UFOs in the area before the village disappeared. According to one report by New Tang Dynasty TV, which has circulated for years, the villagers were transferred in the middle of the night as part of a top-secret operation linked to a secret project, most likely military. A large number of troops were dispatched to the area and moved the whole village overnight. The mission was even given a code name, Operation Nightcat. Chinese officials over the years have obviously denied such claims as nothing more than a rumor. There's not much on this one, again due to China's secrecy, but a theory has been proposed in which China allegedly had a nuclear facility in the mountains and some kind of accident occurred, and they quickly, under the cover of night, relocated the entire village. In a more supernatural take, some suggest the UFOs in the area the nights before forced China to react and remove the village, for some reason. Interestingly, 23 years later, a report would go online in 2010 citing this very same area had a village disappear overnight after UFOs were spotted, which suggests whoever is flying these crafts are very interested in this place. Then again, it's most likely just an urban legend. In fact, New Tang Dynasty TV, where the original story came out so many years ago, has a reputation for publishing fabricated stories. And that brings us to the conclusion of this installment of the Mega Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg Explained. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye, and good night.